Hello and welcome to ManyB. This is the first video in a series where I will deal with Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, and I will do a very, very deep analysis, as deep as my temperament can manage, because there's so many layers in this movie that it's almost impossible to cover it all. And I also think there might be a few, if not quite a lot, of sort of red herrings to maybe divert you away from the core story. But I think there is at least one core story that is different from the common one, which you could call the Jack going crazy story, right? And there's another thing that I might warn you, that my computer might not be able to completely well capture the picture here, because it's I'm on my old laptop, and it's a big PowerPoint show, and it seems like sometimes it struggles with the graphics and so on, right? There's a lot of pictures in the slide, in the PowerPoint show and so on. So I hope it goes well, right? Okay, so first of all, there are two things in this picture here, which is the title, which is the Wendy theory, which is an homage to the person who created a video some time ago, like 2 years ago or something like that, where he presented what he called the Wendy theory. Now, it's very, very, very much, much less detailed analysis than my analysis. But his basic idea is what got me, right? Because usually I don't do this kind of deep dive kind of analysis. I like to, think about movies, but I don't like to take it apart like this, right? This is sort of more like, because this movie is so special. There's so much, and it's so mysterious. After all these years, we are going on, what is it, 40, 45, 46 years now, right? And after this analysis, I'm like, nobody has really, except maybe for a few people, has touched on at least a sub-story that nobody seems to see. And that's why it's called the Wendy theory, because in my opinion, this movie is all about Wendy, nothing else. And that's what I'm going to take a very long and very detailed time trying to explain why I think so. But I made a video sort of some months ago where I asked about this particular, the last shot of Jack in the movie where he sits there in the snow. And I asked, what do you think is the problem with this shot? And I have, let's say, been wondering about this particular shot for many, many years. It's the one shot that I remember going back in time to when I first saw the movie, where I thought to myself, sort of unconsciously, there's something off about this. It comes like, you see this, you have your whole, if you can picture the scene in the maze and Jack chasing Danny. And then he falls over in the snowbank there, and then all of a sudden, cut to this from dark nighttime to daylight, right? Like this, Zing! And there it is. And it always felt off to me. And in later years, I remember thinking, this is the one shot where I think that Kubrick just loses his touch in a way, right? It felt amateurish in a way, right? But there might be more than one reason for this. The first reason, in my opinion, is the cut is deliberately amateurish in order to make you react. I think the way I actually reacted is like, this is a hard cut, right? And this should enable you to, or encourage you to say there might be something about this shot that is sort of different, right? Okay. So I always felt there was, as I said, there was something wrong with the shot. But what I was focused on in that thinking was the cutting, not the actual composition or the content of the shot. Though I felt it looked kind of stupid. Jack looked kind of goofy in this shot, right? I just took it as a kind of humorous, semi-humorous sort of horror comic kind of approach, right? This could very much be Kubrick's idea, right? So I just parked it like that. It's like, oh, whatever, right? But then at some point it dawned on me what is actually the problem here. And this is Kubrick talking to you through pictures, right? What is the problem is that nobody can die freezing to death looking like this. It's impossible, in my opinion. I don't know how many scenarios where you could prove that it's possible, but I think personally this is impossible. And what is impossible is, first of all, that he sits up in this snowbank. It's at least it's uncanny or unlikely. If he dies, he would sort of tip over, right? Like this. And fall to the side or something. He just sits there like, a statue, right? That's the first thing. But the more important thing is his eyes. Nobody can have their eyes looking like that when they die. As you die, or just before you die, you will not be concerned with trying to look at your forehead, right? Or your, up here, your receding hairline, right? You wouldn't do that. So if you're about to die, your eyes will come to level, because this is the natural look of the eyes. They're sort of a default setting, right? So either his eyes would be closed because he's dying, but if the eyelids, right? If the eyelids are open, he would look straight out. I am absolutely convinced. And this is why there's something off about the shot, because his eyes can't look like that, right? And this is also a hint from Kubrick that you should use your eyes. It's about eyes. It's about using your eyes. Look for clues. Look for hints. Look for symbolism, whatever, right? Use your fucking eyes. That's what is off about this. Another thing is that his whole posture, if you see his shoulders, and they sort of converge in a pyramid shape until one of his eyes, right? Okay, that's another, thing, right? And there's also a color coding, which is the green behind him, the hedge, and his red jacket. The combinations of red or green, right? That has and now has been frozen. There's also symbolism in that. Okay. Let's take the next slide. So to cut it short, to present it more precisely, you have a nice shot of Wendy here, and this is actually from the movie. You might not think that, but it is. It's from the actual, you could go and see that shot in the movie, in the US full version, right? Okay, so this presentation is an attempt to settle once and for all what Stanley Kubrick's movie The Shining is actually about. I call this a theory, though strictly speaking, a movie analysis cannot be a theory, something that is empirically scientific. But for the lack of a better term, I call it a theory. And in my opinion, the best theory is the one that, first of all, fits all the evidence, or at least a vast majority of it. It has no glaring holes or contradictions. And it identifies a coherent red thread throughout the movie. And it makes a possible paradigm shift, or indicates why other theories fail. Because it always seems to end up with Jack going crazy and their ghosts, right? I don't think that Kubrick was interested in ghost stories as such. Not that his movie should be about ghosts. And there are very many reasons for why this shouldn't be the conclusion, right? Okay, so before I head further into this thing here, I want to mention these particular sources that has been in some way or another. I just read out here, right? These mentions are for the sake of credit. Most of what I will present in this theory are my own observations, but here and there others have inspired me directly or indirectly to a smaller or larger degree. Okay, so the first one that has inspired me is Rob Navarro. As he's the guy who came up with the idea of the Wendy theory, or at least the first time I heard about it, right? And you can find it on the YouTube channel. On YouTube, he has a YouTube channel, and I haven't checked recently, but I believe it's still there, right? And then there's a guy called Rob Ager who has a channel called on YouTube called Collective Learning. He does a lot of Kubrick analysis, sort of smaller chunks, right? Also some larger analysis, but he takes sort of a particular theme or particular scene, or it's not a complete analysis, but there's sort of hints here and there of what might be going on. But he does a lot of videos on Kubrick, all the other, Clockwork Orange, 2001, Full Metal Jacket, Eyes Wide Shut, and so on and so on and so on, right? And he has been, in some degree, inspiration. And I mention all these because in one go, because I don't want to. I don't remember all the hints. If I get somewhere down the line in this presentation, there might be some point where, okay, this is where I was inspired by that person or this channel or whatever. I can't do that every time. So I list all the ones that I believe have been an inspiration, and then it's done, right? Okay. Then there's a lady on YouTube also who has a channel called Objects of Art, Miss M, who has done a lot of analysis. And I don't agree at all with her conclusions, but she has a sharp eye for looking at art. And this is one point that I think is important here, because you're not only looking at a storyteller, you're looking at an artist creating an artwork. And you have to have an artistic eye for what is going on. If you have a well-developed artistic eye, you're going to see a lot more in this movie than if you're just, standard storytelling, analytic mind, you could say, right? So she has found a lot of interesting little tidbits here and there where I have sort of been inspired. Interesting, right? I don't agree on her conclusions, but that's another story, right? That doesn't mean that whatever she has pinpointed here or there are not relevant, right? Okay. Then there's somebody called C. McFadden, and I don't remember, it's on YouTube, but I'm just listing it here, right? Jay Kearns, a website called Idillopress, Jay Gerard in a huge website called Ice Cream 237, a website with a lot of analysis of the art, the art pieces like pictures and paintings and magazines or whatever books that are placed in the movie here and there, right? He has done a lot of detailed analysis. It's almost, it's like, okay, dude. But if that's your what makes your boat float, so be it, right? Okay, then there's a book called J.D. Salinger, The Catcher in the Rye, which is one of my personal favorite books, right? Also, it's shown in the movie, and it has a cornerstone it has the reference to the book is important to understand. I think it's a hint from Kubrick, right? So this is also an inspiration, right? Freud's The Uncanny, which is something that is not a secret that Kubrick and his fellow scriptwriter was looking into the uncanny, right? By Freud. And S. Crane is a book called The Blue Hotel, a short story that Kubrick mentions in an interview. Michael Ciment, which is that actually that interview, I believe, right? Called a book called Kubrick, where he explains a bit about The Shining. Around the time, the actual interview is probably produced just before the premiere of the movie or just after the premiere of the movie. So it's very close to the very earliest of the finished product, right? Then Lee Unkrich, a book called The Shining. I've seen parts of it. I haven't bought the book. There's a big luxury edition that costs like a small fortune, right? And then there's a budget version, but there's a lot of production detail about the movie, right? And I've seen some hints here and there, and particular some production material around the scene, the hospital scene, the second to last scene in the movie that was removed shortly after the first initial premieres, right? Jung's The Red Book is an inspiration. There's an article called Beyond Genocide by Andrea Tallarita, and then there's an old movie from 1952 called Ghost Ship by a guy called Sewell, or the director. So this is just to mention the most important inspirations to this. So my hat's off to these people for inspiring, right? Okay, so then there's a guy I need to mention also, which I am not inspired by. Okay, so this is a guy called Filippo Olivieri, who's sort of a self-established kind of expert on Kubrick, right? And when he presented a video on some archival research on the July Ball photo, in the last shot you see Jack standing there in this black and white photo, 4th of July, right? And I asks him, what do you think The Shining is about? And he says, we had a bit of back and forth messaging on this video, and I have lifted a lid on what I thought this might be about, or at least some bits of it, right? And then he says, ghosts and family dynamics, certainly not about what you think it is, no matter what it is. Okay, so it's basically you're an idiot, right? So, and then he also in an interview he says, well, Kubrick just wanted to make The Shining. He tried to make a film as popular as possible. How ignorant, right? So I would be careful with this guy, right? Okay, so let's start off a bit with an interview that was presented in Newsweek on May 26, which I believe either was the day of the first premiere. I should have read up on this, but it's very close to if not the same day, then the day after, something like that, right? That the first sneak premieres or limited premieres in New York and Los Angeles had been shown, right? And Kubrick is quoted as saying in this interview from Newsweek, one of the things that horror stories can do is to show us the archetypes of the unconscious. We can see the dark side without having to confront it directly, right? This is what horror is about. It's about seeing the shadow side. It's sort of the Jungian idea of you have the persona, but you can dig in and find some shadows stuff, right? And you can reflect about your own shadow stuff by looking at horror movies, right? And this is very important, I think, because this is his concern. This is what tricks him or triggers him. It's like, that's what's interesting in his expression of art. He's not about horror movies and scaring the shit out of you or something like that. Because at the end of the day, this movie isn't really scaring in this jump scare fashion. It's more unsettling, maybe, to use a term that has been misused referencing this movie. But the unsettling part is a reference to the unconscious rather than just giving you a weird experience, in my opinion, right? Then there's also this one from the Chiment interview in 1980, which is, he says, People can misinterpret almost anything so that it coincides with views they already hold. They take from art what they already believe in or believe, and I wonder how many people have ever had their views about anything important changed by a work of art. No, it's like you come, and this is also up the alley of my philosophy, which is you have to think for yourself, but a part of thinking for yourself is getting rid of all the bad apples, all your dogmas, all your whatever you are invested in without having scrutinized it, right? So when people meet art, they come with all their dogmas and their prejudices, and then they fit the art into how they want to see it, rather than take the art for what it is and try to understand the artist and what the artist tries to say. That's what's interesting to me, and that's why I like Kubrick, because he's trying to talk to me, right? Then there's a famous quote about storytelling and self-deception, and it's sort of up the same alley as Kubrick is referencing, right? And supposedly Mark Twain has said, right, it's attributed to Mark Twain, who said, it's easier to fool people than to convince them that they have been fooled, right? So, and supposedly the actual Mark Twain quote is, every blockhead is thoroughly persuaded that he's in the right. And everyone who is all too firmly persuaded is a blockhead. So it's sort of also a circular argument, maybe, right? He was a bit of a goofy person, this Mark Twain guy, right? But the point is, I think the underlying psychology of what this and Kubrick is trying to say is, if you have already settled on how things are supposed to be understood, you're not going to deviate from it, or it's going to take a lot of contradictory evidence before you know, your opinion has been moved, right? And that is one of the things that Kubrick challenged in this movie. How far in your dogmatic story are you willing to go until you say, okay, now I don't believe this shit anymore. Now it has to be something different. No, what people tend to do is they're just going to fit their own story around what they see. No matter how crazy it is, they're going to invent ghosts and whoever knows what kind of shit in order to explain what they see on the screen, right? But as Abraham Lincoln said, right, don't believe everything you read on the internet, right? Okay. There's a Roger Ebert here. He's a famous film critic, right? Rest in peace. Stanley, he said about this movie, Stanley Kubrick's cold and frightening The Shining challenges us to decide who is the reliable observer, whose idea of events can we trust. It is this elusive open-endedness that makes Kubrick's film so strangely disturbing. And I wouldn't say that's it disturbing, that's what makes it challenging, right? So he doesn't get it either. But he's on the right track here, in my opinion, because he pushes you into accepting ghosts, for instance, right? That's his whole shtick in a way. And that's also the reference he made to that book earlier called The Blue Hotel, which he references in the Chiment 1980 interview and says, you're kind of misled to think something. You're giving a superficial story, but underneath there seems to be evidence of something else. But because you're invested in this superficial, direct story, you're sort of either ignoring the underlying story or just fitting around what you have decided is the story. This is what Kubrick tries to challenge. Okay. Now we are going in, right? Now we're going in. But I'm going in a way where I try to convince you that there is a sub-story that is the actual story. Now you can, if you want, you can have your Jack is going crazy trying to kill his family story and there are ghosts in a hotel and so on. You can actually have that story if you want. But there is a point of fork in the road where you have to make a decision, in my opinion. I am way more in the camp of the Wendy story than the Jack story. And I'm going to explain to you why. Okay, in this shot, which is about a third into the movie, maybe not quite, but thereabout. It's the first sort of where we see Jack in the environment, in the hotel and so on. The first thing we see is this typewriter, right? And then it zooms out or pans out a bit, and it zooms out and pans up. And a bit later, we see Jack throwing this ball against the wall, right? Or this mural above the fireplace. But what is interesting here is what is around this typewriter. And there's a reason why we see the typewriter, and I'll get back to that. The thing to the right, as I write here, at first glance, it seems natural that there is a smoking cigarette, since there is also a cigarette pack to the left of the typewriter, right? The problem is Jack is never seen smoking at any time during the movie. At the same time, Wendy has already been seen smoking twice, and she keeps smoking throughout the movie. This is very unbalanced and demands an explanation. Why is there a smoking cigarette there if we never see Jack smoking? And you could say, well, it's just because, Kubrick chose it this way. Yeah, it's possible. But there might also be another explanation. So there is this cross dissolve when we came into the typewriter scene. We are in the breakfast in bed scene, right? And Jack is sitting there with his bacon and eggs, right? And it dissolves through, and you can see this sort of effect, right? Okay, I'll read out loud here. This cross dissolve leads into the smoking cigarette near the typewriter. The open Marlboro pack and two pointing pencils similarly were arranged as the lighter and a golden pack in the Boulder kitchen, connecting it to the overlook. So if you see, reminded the breakfast scene with Danny and Wendy, where they sit around this checkered cloth on the table and eating their sandwiches, right? There is a golden cigarette pack and a lighter. And they are sort of arranged the same way in this dissolve, right? And they, as I say here, they are placed, connecting it to the overlook, are placed inside Wendy in this dissolve, right? Indicating she is the one smoking, right? The cigarettes pack is pointing, the yellow and the blue is pointing to Wendy in this bluish checkered thing, and there's a checkered cloth on the table, right? She's the one smoking. It's not Jack, right? It's quite obvious, isn't it? And this is also, I might get back to, this is another theme throughout the movie, which is the bleed through thing, that some symbolism in a prior scene bleeds through to the next scene. And this is sort of most clearly illuminated by the blood elevator, right? Okay. Her robe sort of melts together with Jack's light green t-shirt, together enveloping the typewriter. This is to indicate that Jack is a figment of her imagination. She is the one looking at Jack from our view, like she's filming him or creating him. He's a figment of her imagination, right? Jack keeps dipping his bacon into Wendy's eggs, right? And nudge, you know what I mean, right? But there's also another effect here, and he's holding this and she's dipping his bacon, right? But during the dissolve, it's like he's typing on the typewriter, right? So you're being associated, Jack, with a typewriter, obviously, right? But then the cigarette pack is Wendy. So you understand the symbolism here, right? And it's quite complicated, so I might not be the best person to explain this, but this is the best I can do, right? Jack keeps dipping his bacon into Wendy's eggs. It's all of a sexual symbolism, right? On a plate placed similar to the plate in the boulder scene, right? There's the plate there, and the cigarettes over there, the plate there, and the cigarettes over there. But also as if Jack is typing on the dissolving typewriter. The smoking cigarette will only come into view when the dissolve is almost over and close to a very strong shine reflection across the table. And what I'm trying to say is, I'm not going to go back, but if you look up here at the ashtray, and the smoking cigarette is almost split in half by an extremely strong light glare or reflection over the smooth table, right? To indicate there's some kind of shine, quote, going on here, right? So she's shining this into existence in this picture. Okay, so I'm hinting at a way to understand this picture, because I'll get back to it, right? Okay, then there's another which is hugely important, right? This scene, this is way later, right? Jack tells us that he's not a smoker. This scene settles that Jack is not smoking. When Wendy locks Jack inside the pantry or the storeroom, right? Jack immediately tries to get up. He has been dragged in because he's been knocked on the head, right? And then he tries to get up, and his bad leg and all that. But he's surprised that his right leg is hurting, so he stumbled forward into a stack of empty boxes. The boxes have been arranged by the crew. Right? You can see over to the left how the boxes has put in a way, so if you touch the boxes, the top 3 boxes will tip over and reveal what might be behind it. That's actually what happens. Exactly what happens. And Jack Nicholson bumps into these boxes, and these 3 boxes fall down. It's all been arranged. And it reveals no smoking on the wall behind him, right? It's like saying, I'm not the one who smokes. You can't say it any clearer without saying it directly, right? It's as close as it gets. These 3 boxes were supposed to fall and reveal the red no smoking text on the wall. Jack is basically saying, I'm not a smoker, right? And there's also another thing I found in the behind the scenes shot from A Clockwork Orange, right? This behind the scenes shot is from A Clockwork Orange, showing a very similar scenario. This is Kubrick's self-reference, as in pay attention. There's a no smoking sign here on this. I think it's when Alex is in jail. I'm not sure, but I think it's thereabout, right? The Alex guy character in A Clockwork Orange. Okay, next one. Wendy's smoking is a key. When Jack enters the hotel for the interview, there are 5 ashtrays visible in the first shot, right? 1 on each of the 3 tables and 2 standing against pillars. At the reception, there are 2 ashtrays on the counter and 1 against the pillar. As the camera pans, the camera stays stationary, but then it pans and let Jack Nicholson pass, right? It pans with Jack. At least 5 more ashtrays are visible on tables and against the pillar. And there are 2 ashtrays on Ullman's office desk, and he's not seen smoking either, but you could excuse that because there's an interview and whatever, right? There are at least 15 ashtrays shown within the first 45 seconds. 15 ashtrays, right? Okay. Wendy is the only smoker. From the beginning, the movie hammers home that Wendy is a smoker. So why do we never see Jack smoke if he's a smoker? In my opinion, the logic is only Wendy smokes. More importantly, if the shot with a smoking cigarette was supposed to be understood as an objective view, then Wendy would have to have been there at the typewriter, bringing, and I'm taking for granted that Wendy is the only smoking person in the movie. She's the only one seen smoking, and she's always, very often seen smoking, right? So why is it so important that we see her smoke if nobody else smokes, if they actually are supposed to be smoking, right? Okay, so stood as objective view, then Wendy would have to have been there at this typewriter, bringing an ashtray, lighting a cigarette, then leave it, and an empty cigarette box, at most a minute or two earlier, since the cigarette is still smoking. Why would Kubrick be concerned about indicating a presence of Wendy off camera, if there doesn't seem to be any point in doing so other than to confuse the viewer? In my opinion, the alternative is that the smoking cigarette shot is supposed to be understood as someone's subjective first-person view. And since there is a smoking cigarette in it and Wendy is the only smoker, it must be understood as Wendy's view. She is imagining this scene, and she adds a random smoking cigarette to it unconsciously out of her smoking habit. Right? So what we are seeing is not a objective sort of third-person view of the world. We are seeing an imagined kind of first-person view, but it is imbued with the subconscious of the person having this view, and that's why things pop up in the view. You are not seeing, you're like, if you are trying to create a story or write a story or an essay or a novel or anything, write a script, and you imagine something in your head. This is what we are seeing. We are seeing somebody creating a story. And we are having the first person view of that story. And that's why it can become quite weird, because it is imaginary. Or it looks generally realistic, but there's tend to be something that is off, or doesn't match, or doesn't fit, or disappears, or comes into play, and all sorts of shit going on, right? Okay. So what is Kubrick up to? I'll take a cue from Wendy's line in the kitchen during the tour with Halloran, where she says, "This whole place is such an enormous maze. I feel I'll have to leave a trail of breadcrumbs every time I come in." This is kind of a weird thing to say, though she is a goofy character, Wendy, right? But I'm sort of, let's follow the breadcrumbs backwards, as the old fairy tale indicates. So I'm going to the furthest point in the future of the movie, which is the last bit of the movie. How far can you go where Kubrick can still put a breadcrumb and see if there's something there, right? And it's like at the end of the end titles. That's far back, right? Almost back to the rating screen or something like that in the old film days, right? Okay, so let's see. Follow the breadcrumbs. The absolutely last possible scene, you couldn't even call it a scene, right? But part of the movie maybe. And first possible breadcrumb in the movie is when a whistling is heard during the Warner Brothers logo and the end title card. Buried somewhat in the ambient party noise, right? You heard this song, and then the song ends like the music heard during that party earlier in the movie, right? And the song ends, the band stops playing, and there's some clapping and sort of ambient people noise, right? And then someone whistles the River Kwai theme, which is you only hear this. That's what you hear. Listen carefully. I don't think that is. I think it's also in the latest 4K restoration. They haven't noticed this. Anybody has never ever noticed this, I think, right? Okay. This is also known as the Colonel Bogey March, which is used in David Lean's movie The Bridge Over the River Kwai. That's why it's also known as the River Kwai theme, from 1957, with Alec Guinness as Colonel Nicholson, right? The phrase, "all work and no play make Jack a dull boy," is said at some point by the Japanese camp leader. Right? This camp leader says to these English officers, "all work and no play make Jack dull boy," right? Something like that. So this is where Kubrick is saying, I'm playing games with you, in my opinion, right? Why would you let the ambient noise of the River Kwai theme be at the end of the movie when earlier you said follow the breadcrumbs, right? This is a hint back to the typewriter and the type pages, the all work and no play, right? Which Wendy looks at. It's Wendy looking at them, right? Okay, so, okay. Jay Friedkin in the Stanley Kubrick Appreciation Society in podcast 59 recalls on editing out the hospital scene. And I haven't discussed that very much yet, but there was the second to last scene with Wendy in the hospital and Ullman coming and visiting her, and Danny is also there, right? This scene was removed after the first initial premieres, and this guy, Jay Friedkin, which I believe was a son of William Friedkin, late William Friedkin of, The Exorcist fame, right? And, French Connection. During a telephone call the day after the May 23rd, 1980 limited premieres in New York. And what he says in this interview is, the reason I want you to take it out is, and this is Jay Friedkin having Stanley Kubrick calling on the phone, explaining what he wants him to do, right? And Kubrick tells him, the reason I want you to take it out is, and that's the scene that he needs to cut out of the movie from now on, right? Because I have been in screenings with the scene in and with the scene out. With the scene in, the film ends. And people are respectfully quiet, and they kind of just wander out of the theater. No, I made a screw up here. With this, it's the last one should have sent. Oh, I'm okay. Maybe I have to make a follow up on this, but yeah, the lower one is with the scene out. It should have been with the scene out. Some people applaud. They stay through the whole credits. The room feels energized, and that was his explanation why he decided to do it. So sorry about this screw up, but the lower underlined should be with the scene out, right? Okay. In both situations, he says, oh, that's why I did it this way. Sorry, I forgot. It's Jay Friedkin who screwed it up. He says with the scene in this interview. The lower one should probably have been, I'll take what I write. I suppose that he starts talking about this as with the scene in, which would be natural order of description. So in the second situation, he misspeaks. This is the one actually without the scene in, so that this is what he actually meant to see. With the scene out, some people applaud, then stay through the whole credits. The room feels energized. The reason why Kubrick might have been concerned with cutting the hospital scene may very well have been to make sure that the audience stayed during the end credits long enough to actually hear the whistling of the River Kwai march at the very end. So this is why he says he wants people to have this breadcrumb, right? So when that scene is in, the hospital scene, people go out of the theater and nobody hears the whistling. He wants them to hear the whistling, so he figured out when he takes that scene out, people tend to stay in the theater because they're sort of pondering about this, right? But I'll get back to this hospital scene, which is important, obviously, right? So, and I think that this might indicate that he was concerned with this particular end whistling. So let's take a look at this all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy, right? Okay, so first of all, a strong symmetry, right? The complete symmetry, there's a complete square and split in half, and the bottom half and the top half and so on. It's absolutely Kubrick symmetry, if there ever was one, right? There's a duality, light above, dark below, right? There's a two eyes and a mouth is represented in the dark by the typewriter. There's these two rolls on the pin in the, I don't recall what they're called, right? And then there's sort of the opening below with sort of, two eyes and one mouth, right? Which is a recurring theme in the movie. Similar to an earlier shot of Jack. Jack sits by the typewriter, and Jack also sits here looking. This is a cut, a scene that was cut from the movie that shows Jack in a similar pose like Wendy would do at this point, where she discovers this particular writing, right? So there's sort of a mirroring of the same thing going on here, but this was cut by Kubrick, so it never went into the movie, right? The Jack version here, for whatever reason, which is probably lost to time, right? Okay, so let's dig into this all work and no play. When you look at the line, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy, there are some typos, which is generally in all, when she flips through all these pages later, you will see all these various weirdos with typos and so on, right? So, but the only words that have typing are the words makes and play. These are the ones that are having typing errors. If there's a word that has a typing error, these are the two words that have a typing error. And make and play. So he makes a play, right? He makes a play with you, right? Follow the breadcrumbs. Okay, so now listen carefully, right? There are 7 visible lines here and 1 invisible line. And the invisible line is covered by the paper bale. That's what it's called, the paper bale, right? The first to the 5th line is visible, and the 7th and the 8th line is visible. And that's another 2x4 reference, but I'll get back to that. Are visible, and the 6th line is invisible. Now notice the errors in the typing, particularly the strange V to the left of the 4th line. The V is very cumbersome and unlikely for Jack to write, and it is completely out of context. First of all, there's no reason why there should be a V there. And in order to align, if you know anything about how the old typewriters worked, it would be completely ridiculous to write a V there. You would have to either screw around with the paper or adjust the settings of the typewriter and then adjust it back and all that shit. It's hugely unlikely that there would be a V there, considering how the rest of the text is composed. Notice the 7th line has a raised A in makes. You see the middle A there, just above where the typewriter little metal pin is pointing at the raised A. Makes so there's an A and there's a V up there, right? The V points down, the A points up, right? So the V and the A together work as arrows, or two wolf ears, right? Like two ears of a wolf, two pointers, right? That together point specifically to the visible 5th line and the invisible 6th line, right? So the V and the A encompasses two lines. There's one line that is visible, and then there's below that there's another line that is not visible. We don't actually know what is there yet, at least, right? And if you look at Wendy's coat, when she says that line about following the breadcrumbs, her jacket is buttoned in the middle, so her white shirt underneath, sweater, creates two arrows pointing together, like this, in the same way that these arrows encompasses these two lines, right? It's the sort of the duality and the mirroring and all this shit going on, right? There's something that is visible and there's something that is invisible, right? As I say here, Wendy actually shows us this arrow's clue, in the way she wears her jacket. When she mentions breadcrumbs, it is further mirrored in Halloran's jacket in the same shot. Okay. You can go back and look at that particular shot. This book, The Codebreakers, The Comprehensive History of Secret Communication from Ancient Times to the Internet. This is supposedly was one of Kubrick's favorite books. It's famous for pointing out some possible hidden messages in William Shakespeare's books, revealing that it was Francis Bacon who actually wrote them. Well, I'll just leave it at that, right? Okay, so what is it about this sentence? All work and no play, right? It says, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy is an old proverb that means without time off from work, a person becomes both bored and boring. It is often shortened to all work and no play. It was newly popularized after the phrase was used in the movie, the 1980 horror film, The Shining. Okay, so throughout the spirit of the proverb has been expressed previously. The modern saying first appeared in writing in Welsh writer and historian James Howell's Proverbs 1659. It has often been included in subsequent collections of proverbs and sayings. Some writers have added a second part to the proverb, as in Harry and Lucy Concluded, 1825. Harry and Lucy Concluded. And I haven't read that book, right? So, by the Irish novelist Edgeworth. And there is a second line, right? All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. All play and no work makes Jack a mere toy, right? Now this is where it gets interesting, right? And also in one of the October 1977 editions of the screenplay, there's a they change it to this particular proverb, right? Which is interesting. Well, whatever, right? I'll leave it in. That this will observe that this alludes to the ancient British adage, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy, and all play and no work makes Jack a mere toy. Okay, so you can go and check that it's actually there. So what are we dealing with now, right? We have all work and no play visible, and we have a sentence beneath that is invisible. Might Kubrick actually be trying to say there is an underlying story that switches things on its head, which is all play and no work makes Jack a mere toy? So you can see it as Jack is a dull boy, or you can see is all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. But he's not dull, is he? He's crazy. So all play and no work makes Jack a mere toy. I think that Kubrick is trying to say there is an underlying story that is actually more coherent than the one you think it is from the beginning. This is how Kubrick tells the viewer that there is one obvious superficial story plus another underlying more important story where Jack is a mere toy. In the next shot, Wendy has mirrored the 5th line onto the 6th line. Wendy is trying to keep the hidden story hidden, but its imaginary nature keeps bleeding through during the movie as little telltale breadcrumbs for the viewer to find and follow. All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. All play and no work makes Jack a mere toy. The hidden second part of the adverb says Jack is a toy for Wendy to use in her imagination. And he is anything but dull, right? Look at him. The adverb has more to it. Okay. Stanley Kubrick on The Shining. The French issue of Chimen's book came out in 1980, and The Shining interview in it must be from soon after the premiere in 1980. At this point, Kubrick would not have had a good sense of how it would be fully received and adjust how much he could allow himself to reveal. This quote to me is basically an admission that Jack is not the main story. He cannot say it any clearer without directly admitting it, and thereby take all the fun out of it for the reader. He may still at that point have expected viewers to exit theaters wondering if it was Wendy or Jack, the cut hospital scene. The years have shown, though, he hit the Wendy story almost too deep in the horror tropes to be found. Okay, so the quote is, "It is strange that you emphasize," Michel Chiment asks, "It is strange that you emphasize this supernatural aspect, since one could say that in the film you give a lot of weight to an apparently rational explanation of Jack's behavior, altitude, claustrophobia, solitude, or Jack on booze." Then Kubrick says, Stephen Crane wrote a story called The Blue Hotel. In it, you quickly learn that the central character is a paranoid. He gets involved in a poker game, decides someone is cheating him, makes accusations, start a fight, and gets killed. You think the point of the story is that this death was inevitable, because a paranoid poker player would ultimately get involved in a fatal gunfight. But in the end, you find out that the man he accused was actually cheating him. The guy he accused was actually cheating him. And he pointed out something that was actually great. He wasn't crazy. He was maybe paranoid. But it was the story was actually, the underlying story was actually there, though you are forced to believe that it was him that was crazy, right? I think The Shining uses a similar kind of psychological misdirection to forestall the realization that the supernatural events are actually happening. So, in this sort of convoluted way, Kubrick tells you there's more to it than the surface level, right? Okay, so I will cut it off here because I'm going on the 1 hour mark, and this introductory to the movie, before I go into a deep analysis, we'll have a second part, introductory chapter, right? So thank you for listening in. I hope to see you again soon, and please share, like, and subscribe, and let's kick this into orbit, right? Let's get to the final explanation of this fantastic movie. Thank you for listening. See you in the next one.